Mobile is in right pocket. Purse is then I leave. I leave it with one of you. Oh. এবার না পকেটে চাবি আছে, চাবি থাকলে হয় নানা পকেটে গাড়ির চাবি, বাড়ির চাবি। This works. Now this is disturbance free, right? Is this working? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Kaushik, once more. Hello? Hello? Can people at the back hear me? Thank you. Okay, as I said, Kaushik wanted to have in the early part of the semester a non-technical, non-strictly physics talk, and he was clever enough to pick up the person who is physics-wise least useful to the department. So, I start this talk with two disclaimers and one request. The first disclaimer is that I'm going to talk on a topic where I cannot at all be said to be a scholar or an expert. I just have some casual curiosities and I will share them with people. Secondly, there is no definite theme or conclusion that I want to achieve out of this talk. There is no conclusion. Actually, this discussion will be about a loosely arranged assortment of viewpoints with a very broad and loose common theme, common thread. And the thread is the following, that there is a certain role of non-scientific contribution. I did not say unscientific, I said non-scientific contribution, the certainty of non-scientific considerations in matters related to science as a whole, not the research content of science, but science means a number of other issues including social connections, communication, and so on. So there is a substantial non-scientific contribution. So this is being the loose theme. Practically every statement that I'll make can be questioned and disagreed with, and actually I also don't agree with all the statements I am making in this collection, and people are very, very likely to disagree with me. But I have only one request: these disagreements and comments be expressed at the end of the talk rather than in the middle, because something said in the middle on a statement which I may or may not agree with myself may lead to a counter narrative of what I am saying, and will start represent a new viewpoint in which one can go on. So it is better to reserve questions, comments, and such things, rebuttals, till the end, because each such thing will be not a rebuttal of something I am saying, but the opening up of a new way of thinking. That's it. With this request, I start talking. Now, some of us may have the idea that the progress of science as a body of knowledge, now that science is highly rational, is sort of a smoothly flowing, forward flowing, progress oriented approach as such, and there are no give and takes with other ways of thinking and so on and so forth. Keeping this in mind, I start my talk with a few lines comparing the perceived, at least perceived by some, way of scientific progress as a boat beneath a sunny sky, lingering onward heavily, dreamily in an evening of July, not Indian July, July in England, because the author whom I have quoted had dual roles. He did important mathematical work under the name Charles Ludwig Dodgson, which is his real name, and did immortal literary work under the name Lewis Carroll. Now, as I said, the subject matter of the talk is somewhat loosely defined already, but it cannot never be more cogent and more precise than that as we go along. In spite of our expectation about the unidirectionality and so definiteness of scientific progress, actually we should realize that those of us who do science have often faced questions on this or that. These questions are there, addressal or sociology is not my topic, but face various questions which sets us thinking. For example, a question like, can the support of pure science using public funds be justified, or should there be a preferred status for such scientists? The question is something we have heard. I'm not saying whether it's a valid question or not, it's true. Now the scientist has very often involuntarily an usual response, a commonest response to the question. And one of the arguments in reserve for the scientist is that there is a need for others to understand our goal before you ask such question. What we probably emphasize less is that there is a need for us also to understand others' goals, and a sustenance of scientific activity as part of social activities requires a cross-border dialogue in some way. By science here, I mean basic sciences, and by others, I mean not merely lay persons, they are included, but more importantly for this talk, intellectuals or creative persons in other pursuits of human activity who make no less enrichment to the human society, and also people who have important, good or bad, I am not saying, roles in the society, such as bureaucrats, legal personalities, politicians, and so on. Now, questions for these others or outsiders may be faced at both the individual level and the collective level. I am giving you a few random examples. One, why should basic science consume substantial public funds? I am not justifying or opposing, I am just quoting them. Why should basic science consume public funds? Where does its accountability lie? This I have heard myself sitting in front of some Niti Aayog high-ups and similar persons in the bureaucracy earlier. Then a more specific example is the Large Hadron Collider experiment at CERN in Geneva, something which is related to my own field of research. It raised umpteen questions about spending billions of dollars on fundamental science in this way, and also as specific objections by some scientists that this brings in the fear of mass destruction in the human society. Then there is an experimental effort called India-based Neutrino Observatory in the making, which is not taking off for nearly 2 decades now. Let's not go into the reasons, but one of the obstructions has been that wherever the site of this experiment was sought, there were objections from environmentalists and others that this is a threat to the environment or ecosystem. Unfortunately, it has been found out that some of them are based on incorrect factual understanding. In general, this is also sometimes said that possibly scientists or the scientific community functions, basic science community, forget about technocrats, function in relatively exclusive, comfortable, and privileged environment. Again, I am not justifying or opposing. These statements we hear, and so on and so forth, and that it sometimes this kind of antipathy, if you can call it so, cuts deep in some of our colleagues who are not in science, is evident for an example of mine, experience of mine in very recent time. A friend of mine who is a social scientist is a vice chancellor of a university now. One day in course of a very casual conversation some times ago, he said that, look, whatever you scientists do, that succeeds in your own domain only. But when it comes to running a university like mine with umpteen complications, we social science people are much better equipped to tackle such problems than you pure scientists are. Again, Not the content, but the tone or tenor of this statement convinced me that he, as a social science person, had a chip on the shoulder about scientists. So this happens. So when such things occur, the commonest reaction of the scientist is one of outrage. Again, I am quoting a line of poem. I am not giving deliberately the name of the poet because I am using it in a different context. The poet is Arthur O'Shaughnessy. World losers and world forsakers on whom the pale moon gleams, yet we are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. That is a scientist's self-assertion against such objections. But the question is, does it seem so to others as well? And the others I have already defined. Does it seem true? And an allied question that may come up is, do scientists try to understand other creative persons who probably show pathetic misunderstanding or lack of understanding of science, but are extremely creative and profound and rich in their contribution in other ways? Now, the reason that the reaction to such questions I mentioned is somewhat outrageous, it sounds from our side, the reaction sounds outrageous, is because of a collective memory, something in the racial unconscious of science. And by science, I basically mean Western science, because that's what we all practice now. So they have a collective memory of their early period of being gagged by religious institutions during the Middle Ages and post-Middle Ages as well. And the spirit of inquiry and scriptural dictats suppressing rational thinking, that kind of mounted heavy on them, still bothers them. We all know the history of Bruno to Galileo and so on. And the result is a moral indignation that hurts us. It does, indeed. It hurts me also when I hear things. Sometimes, at moments of overreaction, this amounts to even a paranoid reaction. People say that, okay, now there are no religious organizations which are entirely able to suppress it, but since social psychology replaced theology, the progress is twice as quick. If a conscience is tender and loath to surrender, you have only to whisper, you are sick. Sick means sick in the American sense. Sick means abnormal. Yeah. This is a few lines written by W.H. Auden, the America-based poet of recent times, who kind of, in some ways, was the harbinger of what is called postmodernism in Western thinking. Now, although we may think that this kind of apathy towards scientific ways of functioning of ours is due to things like the politicians' manipulations, religious obscurantism, or just uninformed minds resisting reason. This is our thinking. But actually, the root is a bit more widely spread. One can trace it back to post-Renaissance enlightenment period in Europe, where actually, according to, this is the name of a book of a recent author, Reason, Romanticism and Revolution, where at least three great manifestations of this enlightenment in Europe. But the onset of modernity can be in some sense traced to these. And the expression or impact of substantive reason based on this worldly consideration, not necessarily theological considerations or not universally theoretical consideration, that kind of asserted itself during this enlightenment period, although highly reason-based thinking processes can be traced to people from the early Christian era to Middle Age, so-called Dark Age. I can name at least three persons, but I'm not naming them now. But the science reflected in three kinds of things major in the way. Here I am using a classification made by a recent thinker called Jürgen Habermas. He was depending on the work of some German scholar called Max Weber in turn in the early part of 20th century, but Habermas's writing goes back to the 1980s or so on. Three aspects in which this enlightenment asserted itself. They were, number one, objective science. Number two, universal morality and law. That includes philosophy, ethics, and several other things. And number three, autonomous art. Autonomous means not under the clutches of some biblical dictats, although biblical themes form the content of much of this art. But as time went along, for reasons that probably I don't have to even explain, objective science got gradually the driver's seat. And the other ways of self-expression, or proponents of the other ways of self-expression, started feeling insecure about it. This can be seen at the very beginning of the age of reason I'm talking about. For example, there was a famous poet called John Donne around 16th, 17th century who belonged to a particular school of poets. One of his poems is called For Whom the Bell Tolls. This title was used later as the title of a novel by Ernest Hemingway based on the theme of the civil war in Spain. But For Whom the Bell Tolls can be written, traced back to Donne's poem. And there the distress that was expressed was the distress at universal humanism being sacrificed on the altar of individualism. Individualism basically here in the context of this poem means human beings treated based on certain data which emphasize their universals, individual self. And that, according to such poets of that area, was a distress to more universal ways of thinking. This was kind of fanned by the Romantic period authors also in Europe, 19th century. I have come down by 2 centuries, who also felt that, for example, literary areas like poetry actually conveys profounder truth than science based on facts and figures does. This was, and these should be decisive in deciding the progress of the society and human civilization and so on. For example, Percy Bysshe Shelley had to write an essay called In Defense of Poetry, where he said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. He had to say it because the legislatorship, in their view, was passing towards objective science. What is said as objective science, rightly or wrongly, I'm not saying. Also, William Wordsworth also expressed his distress that the human being, as he or she grows up, knowing more and more about the reality of the world, actually this fact causes a degeneration in the human being in terms of his pure human feeling, which is kind of spiritual. For example, he said, the youth who daily farther from the east must travel, still is nature's priest, and with a vision splendid is on his way attended, till the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. Light of common day was prosaic facts the observations of the world lead to. So this distress can be made obvious. Now, in very recent decades, coming down to the 20th century until its end and early 21st century also, there have been reaction to the worldview where so-called modernity tried to dictate things in terms of logic and sort of substantive reason, where even on cultural matters, certain cultural norms were attempted for establishment. And there was a section of people who mostly belonged to the so-called continental philosophers, a good number of whom reacted strongly against this highly logic-based or even mathematics-influenced approach to philosophy. For example, the stating things objectively became sort of anathema to these people. For example, there was a recently died philosopher called Richard Rorty, who was the proponent of a school called empirical behaviorism, said even we should scrap the notion of an objective world and speak of views which our culture at its best accepts. And he was including science also there. The scientific truth and the views are arising out of them is accepted if our culture at its best finds it acceptable. Then there was a famous author called Umberto Eco, with whose writing people must be familiar. Name of the Rose is a novel for which he was familiar. But he was a philosophical thinker also, who straddled between postmodernism on one side and what is called semiosis, or study of symbols in cultural matters and culturalism in general, where he says and emphatically maintains, and I personally find some elements of truth there, that a give and take between shared and personal knowledge. Scientific knowledge is not personal knowledge. That's what can be shared by anybody who is scientifically trained. A give and take between such knowledge and personal knowledge, that is to say subjective elements, goes into the construction of any worldview, and that includes the worldview of science, according to Eco. Then there has been a recent author called Paul Feyerabend, who was actually a firebrand iconoclast, became a little noticeable in the 8th decade of the last century when I was in college. So we got attracted to this book called Against Method, where he spoke in favor of what is called logical anarchism, and leaving aside all other rhetorics, which were largely the content of that book. He maintained that no well-defined methods can lead to scientific progress. So such views have been rampant, and not all these people can be treated as obscurantists or fanatics or anything, but such views starting from the Renaissance period or Enlightenment period till current period have persisted side by side, whether we like it or not, as unavoidable facts of the world. And many of the proponents of these ideas, I'll have to quote a few others, have been not only useful but valuable contributors to the body of human knowledge and human civilizations. Given all this, okay, may I postpone the exposition till the end, because this is a useful question. There is a very important book by Umberto Eco called The Kant and the Platypus. But then I have to spend a few minutes exposing it. Let me wait till then. Please remind me of this question. Now, in spite of all this, or in the backdrop of all that I said just now, the scientists, rightly in my view, and unconsciously for most science people, they stake a claim to superior treatment, I mean intellectual superior treatment, because of a number of things. Science has, first of all, whether we like it or not, outright or potential practical applications. Secondly, one of the most glorious kind of triumphs is that it is based on reproducible empirical data and possibly constitutes objective knowledge of the external world. And scientific judgment or statements or propositions are what is called cognitive in character. This is there, this isn't there. Is a assertion of an existence or non-existence or truth or falsity of a statement. Now, of course, science involves one's inner world also. Without that, no thinking would be possible. But largely, the inner world interferes in the use of mathematics in particular and some kind of logic, depending on which branch of science it is, and is largely independent. This largely should be probably written in italics, of the scientist's own personality. Now, let us compare this with the artist's work, which has its essence in the inner subjective feeling, and that's the most treasured part of the artist's work. The external world constitutes ingredients of the artist's work, or the objective world, if you can say, ingredients of the artist's work, and sometimes instruments of the artist's work. For example, for a filmmaker, it is like that. Now, the judgments or statements they make are not always or mostly cognitive, excepting peripheral ones, but emotive in character. That is to say, at the kind of extreme case, if it is a statement with a subject and a predicate, we know what they are. I am going, I am the subject and I am going is the predicate. Or Professor Narayan Banerjee is our colleague. Professor Narayan Banerjee is the subject, is our colleague is the predicate, which describes it. But while in scientific statements, it is always cognitive that this kind of statement is there. Artistic statements or aesthetic judgments are what is called emotive. At the extreme, that is an emotive or emotionful exuberance of the judgment. For example, if we want to talk about Taj Mahal, the Taj Mahal is so beautiful is a particular sentence where it can be rephrased as how beautiful is the Taj Mahal, where this predicate becomes a subject and the predicate is a statement of emotion. So I think I convey the fact that these kinds of statements of the artist are substantially different from scientific statements. Of course, it has strong influence of personalities and schools, and that is a source of richness, the lack of objectivity in arts. But can we deny it? We cannot. I mean, and we cannot wish away art or should not wish away art. What I want to say in fine prints is that not in the actual research content of science, but in the way we communicate, get recognition, and get practical advantage also depends on aesthetic elegance in the way we put it. For example, while getting a grant or some such things, when I make a presentation in form of in presence of a set of judges who may constitute non-science people, some of them at least, then the elegance of presentation, which is a lesson we learned from the artist in a broad sense, becomes a deciding factor, as I have myself seen many times. Also, when it comes to reaction of or impact on the non-scientific community, educated non-scientific community, some of the aesthetically well-designed statements very often stick on and sometimes leads to false interpretation, but it does. So aesthetics has a role. For example, Einstein's famous statement as a rebuttal of quantum mechanics that was being developed. He said, Raffiniert ist Herr Gott, Botschaft ist nicht. What does it mean? Subtle is the Lord, malicious he is not. The interpretation is up to the non-science person, but this has stuck on, as we find out in our interaction with the non-science community. And so much so that a scientist like Abraham Pais, when he was writing a book on Einstein, chose the subtle is the Lord. These publishers are very clever people. They knew that this would attract people from the non-science community towards this book. So in the propagation, dissemination, and appreciation of scientific truths or falsities, arts play a role. Now let's compare scientist's role with the philosopher's work. I'm not going too broad, but by philosophy I mean essentially the analysis of concepts and criticism of beliefs. There, for example, concepts such as knowledge, reality, truth, etc. And this cannot be denied that this has a role in our scientific understanding and in the foundation of science. In its most serious form, philosophy is logic-driven. Statements have to be justified. It is not data-centric, although data can be used for the illustration of certain philosophical views. And it is again largely dependent on schools. Different ways of looking at things as far as the real world is concerned is there. And in a way, it enlightens us by providing rational viewpoints where objective judgments become impossible to make. For example, take the concept of truth. There are several theories, I'm not going to describe them in detail, about what truth of a statement means. One is, for example, the coherence theory of truth, basically logical consistency being the guideline, which is often used by mathematicians and other formal disciplines of science. There is the correspondence theory of truth. Actually, there are many more. I am stating the three major ones. Correspondence theory of truth, where the truth or falsity of a statement depends on whether it actually corresponds to something happening in reality. And this is used by physical scientists, most of the science, life scientists also largely, and so on. But after all, there is a third kind of truth theory that's called the pragmatic theory of truth. Something which is ultimately working in practice is the hallmark of the truth of a scientific statement. Now, there are situations where this works. For example, in talking about cosmology, in talking about many things in biomedical sciences, these become the criteria of truth. So, in order not to unnecessarily talk at cross purposes and to make the grounds on which the truth or otherwise of a scientific statement is being judged, these kinds of theories of truth handed down to us by philosophers are definitely something that scientists should feel indebted for. Now, we compare it with the social scientists' work. Social science is also data centric. Also, it has its intrinsic logic, inherent logic. It is very difficult to state exact laws of social science. The conclusions we talk about are mostly statistical. It also has a big role of schools or viewpoints when it comes to economics, even history, political science, sociology, and things like that. And the judgments are not always cognitive, the way I talked about, not always emotive, but sometimes is, because in our very impassioned judgment about some historical phenomenon, emotive issues come in, and it's also what's called conative. That is to say, whether something should be done or not is connected with the spirit of a statement. And that is obviously true in social science when it comes to things like economic choices and so on. Now, the other thing is that when you use data in social science, these data invariably contains sentient beings and their inner world. Medical science also uses sentient beings, but apart from some very specific areas like psychology or psychoanalysis, it is observed facts about sentient beings. But if I talk to him and her, then about some social science issue, then when you have to ensure, or rather acknowledge, that the responses depend on the way the listener's mind or my data point's mind, my guinea pig's mind is working. And that often has an impact on social principles applied to issues in general and conclusions or inferences being drawn out of them. And it affects, again, science to some extent, not the science research content, but the acceptance, rejection, resistance, acknowledgement as far as some scientific work is concerned. One example, for example, is Einstein's work, his Annus Mirabilis, where he wrote 5 epoch-making papers in the same year, 1905. After that, even I think about 7 years after that, 7 or 8 years, when Max Planck recommended Einstein or nominated Einstein for the fellowship or membership of the Prussian Academy of Science, they had a high screening standard. He had to practically, I have read the statements, I don't have it in my mind, he has to practically apologize for Einstein's excesses in terms of treating the photons, saying that light consisted of particles. He said that although this youth has gone a bit too far making such a hypothesis and claiming that to be truth of nature, which was proven in 1916 by Millikan, that in spite of that, I may remind the academy that this young person is extremely talented, and I recommend that he be admitted to the Prussian Academy. Why was that? Because again, it was a social interaction, something being put forward in presence of a community which has its own ways of thinking, and the German community, scientific community at that time, was rather conservative and resistant to theoretical ideas based on too much of speculation. Whether photoelectricity, photon hypothesis can be called too much of a speculation is, of course, being treated very differently by us today, but this is the mindset which operates. So, in the process of this, the social principle. Now, how I am affected by this statement, how I am responding because of my inner making, has a role in the propagation of science. Of course, to everybody's relief, it did not stop Einstein. Finally, I am coming back more to it. Now, in spite of all these things, that other ways of thinking by creative persons influence scientific judgment or scientific acknowledgement, interaction, etc., and the progress, the scientist has a claim to distinction still, and it stems largely from the capacity for objective interpretation and prediction of reproducible data, as I said, and the relative absence of personal elements in the methodology. However, as I have been emphasizing time and again, I am repeatedly, deliberately repeating some of the statements because these are not the usual ways in which we think when we talk about science, that scientific activities actually should comprise more than just the objective content of science itself. And in this, beyond strictly research content, subjective issues or school dependent issues do creep in there. This goes into teaching also. When I come to a class and find a gentleman teaching me general theory of relativity in a particular way, I get enamored by this. And another teacher coming and teaching another subject may be actually more profound in his or her understanding, but the presentation being somewhat indifferent, I decide that no, general relativity is a superior subject for research compared to anything else. So there are these things also as part of scientific activities, and their subjective issues do creep in. And there are influences of these in things like policy decisions, in recognition given to scientists, and overall outlook towards the way research should be pursued. For example, it comes to things like which project to fund, one on genetic or in building of a particle accelerator. Here I am driven by some subjective considerations. Long before the Large Hadron Collider, there was, considerably before, the plan of an even more high energy particle accelerator called the superconducting super collider. It was in the making. I have myself walked through the tunnels of that in the Texas area, but it was struck down in 1993 by the US Congress because people thought human genome project was more higher priority, so they couldn't fund both the projects. So SSC got axed. Then the historical resistance of Arthur Eddington to Chandrasekhar's celebrated idea. Although Chandrasekhar got his recognition in later time, at that time the scientific world was not prepared for his quote-unquote revolutionary character, and a conservative but highly established scientist like Arthur Eddington did not find it, could not approve it depending on his mindset. Then this is decision, this is recognition. Overall outlook constantly shows a tension between the top-down and the bottom-up approach in science theory building. Top-down means starting from some unitary principles and then coming to individual cases through deduction and establish scientific truths. Bottom-up means assembling piecemeal evidences and conclusions and finally building up to the high-end, unitary, all-compassing scientific theories. There is a tension. There cannot be any universal decision in favor of one or the other, but the preference for one or the other very often have influenced the course of scientific work in a particular epoch, depending on whether the top-down school or bottom-up school is more influential. Now, some more reasons behind subjectivity is that scientists, all scientists, and of course non-scientific people, they always have limited access to empirical data. At any point of time it is limited, and limitations to sometimes have limitations in their training or capacity to judge them also. That in between facts which are so verifiable or verified and taken as starting points, and predictions which are verifiable or falsifiable as facts, there lies the process of logical steps. Those steps constitute theories. But these steps are not just logical deductive steps in the mathematical way. There are inductive things depending on empirical inputs at various stages. And as I said, because of our limited access to data and so on, in such steps, one person may give more weightage to one piece of empirical evidence, another person may give it weightage to a different piece, and this is bound to happen, however erudite and impersonal the judge person is. So till the final truth is known, which is probably never known in science in that sense, there remains a difference in the conclusions achieved. And most of us, most of the time, are in the intermediate steps. All of us are. And there is no objective status reports in the final form. At such a stage, very often it is impossible to objectively choose between two competing theories. Here, the sociology of the community leads to the accept of one or the other. Again, a very interesting example is an alternative theory of gravity in the light of, but in difference from Einstein's general relativity. There was a mathematician come philosopher come science trained person called Alfred Whitehead, based in Harvard. Around early 1920s, he offered an alternative formulation of Einstein's general relativity. Basically, the basic concepts were the same, but the starting variables which he thought were decisive were not what Einstein thought, but some other different quantities, tensors. I mean, technically some alternatives to the Riemann-Christoffel tensor. These were Whitehead's starting point, that these are probably the decisive things in describing gravitation. And all the predictions of general relativity till then, notably the Marconi-Perihelion rotation and the bending of light beams till those days, both were reproduced exactly by Whitehead's method, rather Whitehead's hypothesis than by Einstein's hypothesis. However, Whitehead did not stand a chance at all, although in the 1970s, actually Whitehead's methods uselessness, or rather that Whitehead's method was not giving the right results, was shown as late as in the 1970s. But right from its inception, people didn't even pay attention to Whitehead's work. I have a copy of his paper with me. Didn't pay attention. And now we know rightly, because Einstein was already a world celebrity. So sociology works. At that time, there was no way to choose between one or the other as far as the experimental predictions are concerned. But the sociology or public feeling, even in the scientific community, does affect one's judgment about a proposed scientific theory. And also there are while communicating, even in the way of convincing others, the scientist's personal feeling does show up. I have already talked about this. And again, scientists' own philosophical or socio-political preference affects the nature of communications, affects the recognition accorded, which we can see not only in today's India, but also in Europe and other countries today. And for example, this Einstein's contemporary Germany and so on. The net result I want to emphasize is that what is conveyed by scientists, remember, conveyed by scientists, not the actual content, and the way it is accepted can be less objective than is commonly thought. We depend on criteria such as coherence, logical simplicity, economy of principles, etc. Occam's razor, some extreme, almost fundamentalist formal theories give a lot of importance to these, but these can be questionable, at least as fuzzy as moral or ethical or aesthetic judgment sometimes. That is why some people have made such statements. And here, Hilary Putnam, I am quoting, one of the most well-known philosophers of science in recent times. He was not just a philosopher. He made important contributions to computer science through algorithm calculation and so on. So Putnam's method is something. So he had first-hand full acquaintance with the way of science. He says that paradigmatic science, which is physics, and Putnam knew about physics very well, that itself depends on judgments which are non-scientific. He has an article called Non-Scientific Methods in Science, which I find very appealing, and says that with his full regard to the glory of science, that the idea that exact science exhausts rationality is a self-stultifying error. And this was no denigrating statement. This was his analysis which led him to this conclusion. An obvious question is that why then we accord science its exalted status? Should we all step down and say, "Nay, enough is enough. We are not as rational as we are made out to be. So let us put down our crown"? The reasons that is premature or unwarranted is that, in my view, all said and done, and some others' views also, all said and done, the scientific style has an element of genius in it. Because nothing succeeds like success, in spite of this somewhat unsure, occasionally conceptually unsure steps taken, ultimately it wins. And why is that so? It uncovers the mysteries of nature even when there is deviation from a strictly logical approach on occasions. One likely cause, as many people have tried to think, is in spite of all the pitfalls or looseness or subjectivity that I was referring to just to drive my point home, is that there is an inherent impersonality in the science. And this is not always strictly definable also as compared to social science, but these are some of the reasons. Ultimately, therefore, science sets the paradigm of truth finding whenever we are functioning based on reproducible things. I'm just ending this talk with two examples of where not strictly logical but very useful methodologies of science depend on something which they have probably borrowed, scientists have borrowed from logicians. One of them is what is called plausible reasoning. Suppose A implies B, and we have seen B. That doesn't prove that A is true, right? However, if A implies B and also A implies C, then and we see both B and C happening, then that makes A more credible. In the first case, we can't make a statement about the credibility of A. In the second case, A is more credible. For example, when we are talking about the early universe, this Big Bang hypothesis or theory based on a particular mathematical construction following from Einstein's theory of general relativity, it is no way to verify whether what was the universe in the early phase. Some consequences are predicted, one of whom is the cosmic microwave background radiation. So A is Big Bang, based Big Bang cosmology, B is CMBR. Observation of CMBR, does it immediately accredits A? Probably it's difficult to say. But there are several other predictions of Big Bang cosmology and what's called this Friedman, Robertson, Walker universe, which are also gradually getting accepted through certain observations now that cosmology is a data-driven science. So we are having not only one B and one C, but several Bs and Cs, which is enhancing the credibility of Big Bang psychology, Big Bang cosmology. Now, this method is often used in biomedical studies also, if you see. It's not possible to have the exact mechanism of something. This medicine works in him, works in me, works in him. Rather than this medicine works only on this person. In the first case, if it is this 3 persons become 3,000 and this 1 person becomes 10, then in the second case, we have enhanced credibility. Sometimes in physical sciences too, as I have given an example about already. And on social and economic issues, this is a very widespread guiding principle for us. Now, another example I am giving, that is finding out about some cause behind something through circumstantial implication. In Indian epistemology, this has been debated by people. This is called arthapatti, and whether this circumstantial implication is a part of inference or not. About that, philosophical schools are divided. One school believes that it is nothing but what is called reductio ad absurdum. According to some other schools, no, it's a different kinds of implication. I'm not going into that debate. But suppose we have a puzzling observation and no direct principle to explain it. Then if we start exhausting all possible explanations and find each of them is not working, then what is left is perhaps the explanation. This perhaps is inevitable. For example, a person is constantly monitored from 3 in the morning till 2 at night, 2 in the morning next day, 23 out of 24 hours, and not seen eating or drinking anything. But still we see the person healthy and well built and so on. If we leave out supernatural explanations and exhaust all other possibilities, one that remains is that it is between 2 and 3 that the person is having some food and drinks which is balanced and useful and sufficient, and that is sustaining the health of the person. This is not strictly scientific, the way we are used to learning about science through experience or other observation and inference. But this sometimes turns out to be decisive. One example is the existence of the particle called neutrinos. It is a fundamental particle which is produced in beta decay of nuclei. Around 1920s or just at the doorstep of the 1930s, this beta decay phenomenon was studied in detail when radioactivity came in and quantum mechanics was gradually taking off. People found that the beta decay process, where out of a neutron decaying, you discover a proton and an electron and nothing else. But this decay is found not to conserve energy, momentum, and angular momentum. 3 holy cows sacrificed. It was a big puzzle initially. We don't see anything else. It was so much so that that was the period when quantum mechanics was in the making, and a stalwart like Niels Bohr, who was one of the leading characters at that time, he went on to the level of claiming that perhaps in quantum or subatomic phenomena, event by event conservation of energy, momentum, or angular momentum is not to be expected. Now we know, but in those days people went to this extent. No other explanation was found. At that time, a young person called Wolfgang Pauli said, why don't you think that there is an invisible spin-off particle, for some reason we don't see it, it is produced. Although it produced some initial resistance, people took that idea, carried it further, developed the theory of weak interaction, and this particle proposed by Pauli called neutrino was observed in experiment some 22 years after it had been produced, it had been proposed by Pauli. This is a classic example of, and all other explanations were failing. This is a classic example of arthapatti or circumstantial inclination. But that marks one of the landmarks of science. I have come to the end of my talk, and in time, hopefully, Kaushik, since I started 5 minutes or 6 minutes late. First, there are areas where the objectivity of science cannot be flaunted ultimately. Again, not scientific research, but the way science accepted, exchanged, communicated, and so on. Second is that some subjectivity and irrationality are unavoidable components of human nature. Each of us is irrational in some ways. Very few people notice that, but there is a famous economist called Herbert Simons, a Nobel-winning person, whose claim was that it is wrong to say, kind of base any economic theory or social theory by assuming that human beings are basically rational beings. Actually, all human beings are irrational beings. That should be the starting point, according to Herbert Simons. And these are components of human nature. Sometimes it can be for the better, as we have seen in some examples, but this is undeniable. And therefore, science is best sustained. This is again a very subjective view. This is one of the views. If scientists acknowledge non-scientific elements in their approach at the same time. Non-scientific, I repeat, does not mean unscientific. And this acknowledgement will probably, to the scientist, soften the blow of some criticisms, and they may be a little misunderstood, less misunderstood, and this blow of criticism would be softened. Criticisms of this kind, this is attributed to Noam Chomsky. As soon as questions of will or decision or reason or choice of action arise, human science is at a loss. Thank you very much. Achha, I think we should begin by addressing Supratim, because can you state your question once more? But I am saying my answer will not be an answer to an objection. Probably it will be a new viewpoint to which I can give my response at most, if I am possible. Please.
I just wanted a clearer definition or understanding of what exactly is meant by personal knowledge, because in that statement it was distinguished from shared knowledge.
Okay. Shared knowledge, in a loose sense, for example, all empirical knowledge is shared. But I'm telling you.
But even non-empirical knowledge is shared.
Yes, some mathematical knowledge is also shared. But
religious beliefs are shared.
Religious beliefs, I don't know whether they're shared. Because you may have religious belief, I may not have any religious belief, or there is no empirical way of deciding that. So religious belief, I don't know whether that can be brought in.
Within a community, yeah.
Exactly. To some extent, yes. So you want to know the difference. Here I am referring to the book from which, based on which I made this statement, or rather took this statement. It's a book by Umberto Eco called Kant and the Platypus. The very vague title. Platypus is there any biologist present who can correct my mistake? Platypus is an animal which is mammal and which has features of mammals and reptiles in them. They lay eggs, but they have mammals. Exactly. Now, that is something that he refers to in two senses. First is Kant and all the philosophers of that time and in recent times believe in categories in existence, as they are called. Quality, substrate, thinking process, and so on. Now, sometimes people have got this so-called analytical philosophers a bit overboard in defining categories and strictly debating about the validity or precision of this definition. But what Umberto Eco tries to emphasize, being a so-called postmodernist who kind of revolt against very strict cultural norms, Umberto Eco argues that there are categories of existence which cannot be compartmentalized that much. Step number one. Step number two is personal and shared knowledge. Now, Kant was a person who pointed out that just perception and inference cannot be the exhaustive ways of gaining knowledge. Again, Kant's statement has been debated for centuries. I'm not taking any sides. I'm not even educated enough to take any sides. But according to him, any piece of knowledge includes, or kind of assimilation of knowledge includes, what is called a priori judgment. A priori means even before I see something or start examining a mathematical judgment, some concepts are built into me, and this inbuilt concepts decide on a large scale or an individual scale what exactly is the stature of that judgment about knowledge. So here there is a give and take between, according to him, shared knowledge is principles of mathematics, principles of physics, and so on. A priori knowledge is our idea of space and time. For example, now if you are guided to a particular picture of space and time, that is not part of your inference, nor is that part of your empirical judgment. For example, but that influences whether you pronounce something to be a fact of the world or not. For example, if we believe, and in Kant's time we knew only Newton's mechanics, we believe that the world around us follows Euclidean geometry. That is, if today you have two persons, suppose you know the development in the subsequent centuries and I don't know anything about it, I am still sitting in 18th century, then I will still believe my personal knowledge will be that the world is after all following Euclidean geometry. Your knowledge will be no. But when I make my judgment, I will tend to think that this is the universally applicable, a truth of the universe pronounced by a purely axiomatic subject like Euclidean geometry. But your judgment will be no, no, no. You have not studied general relativity, it is not my fault. You draw 3 angles of a triangle, add up to 180 degrees. I will say it's universal fact. You will say that you draw a big enough triangle on the surface of a sphere like the earth and the angles won't add up. So this is where the judgment about, this is too clear-cut a judgment to really bother us now. This is a judgment where the role of personal knowledge and the role of shared knowledge have some interplay. One may confuse or confound the other, but it is non-negligible as far as human nature is concerned. This is very roughly what I wanted to say. We can discuss further about it. Ananda has a bombshell for me. Okay, let me answer him, then I'll go to it. I can't answer anybody, by the way. I can give my reaction if I have any, because I am not. Yes. 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 Exactly. Dawkins goes the opposite extreme. Opposite extreme, exactly. Keats I did not, because I thought people would get tired enough if I mentioned Shelley once, Wordsworth once, and again talk about Keats. And I find Keats the least understandable from my own point of view. That's the other thing. Sorry, there was a comment from.
So Rajesh, wait for some time.
No, no. Oh, sorry. So probably others didn't hear Professor Dasgupta. Oh, please.
Yeah. So the last slide when you concluded, so there was last thing was the sense of reproducibility should be there. So if you
But it is not there in this slide.
Before this one, there was a sense of reproducibility.
It was there.
Yes.
Is it there? It's not there either.
Somewhere. I don't know. Yeah. Ultimately, there are some theories where this reproducibility in that sense. Are you talking about the experiments or what?
Yes, when it is reproducibility, it's two sense. It's definitely in the experimental sense. That's what we know. Okay. An experiment performed in IISER lab and an experiment performed in Stanford under identical circumstances must reproduce the same result up to errors. But there is a theoretical sense of reproducibility as well, because I propose a mathematical theory for explaining something in particle physics, which is my area. I have done a 20-page calculation and produced the results. But if it is a striking enough claim, it is encouraged that theorists from elsewhere also carry out the calculation. They may correct some error or point out some error, not merely because I made an algebraic mistake writing 2 in front of 3, but in the successive steps that I use, particularly in explanation of physical sciences, some assumption unknowingly goes into some step of calculation, which you don't make, and therefore you don't reproduce my result.
Okay, so there should not be any correlation between what you are doing theoretically and if it can be produced experimentally. So you are not meaning this here.
No. What I was going to say, that ultimately for a scientific theory to succeed, experiment must be reproduced by theoretical product, or rather theoretical prediction must be reproduced or verified in experiments, up to errors, of course.
Yeah, but sometimes that is not, means it's the experiments are not even possible. Maybe yeah.
Yeah. If experiments are not possible, then whether the theoretical prediction bears the ultimate truth remains questionable. For example, if you are thinking of a fundamental theory, a claimed theory of everything, at least what it was till some decades ago, yeah, called string theory.
Yes, sir. That is
Yeah,
what I was
so whether string theory is the truth of nature, we don't know. Unfortunately, some, what should I say, propagandists of string theory go overboard and try to claim that it is already a proven theory, but nothing could be further from the truth. The scientific community doesn't belittle the mathematical elegance, the novelty of approach, etc. of string theory, but it is extremely misleading, or I think wrong, to call it a theory of nature. It is not a truth of nature yet. About that, I think everybody is unanimous. Whether the philosophical viewpoints I mentioned here are true or not, this is definitely something that we agree. Thank you.
Anything else?
Please.
Yeah. So I'm not entirely clear on where you stand on this, but most of the time when we speak of, the subjective element in science, the way we speak of it is, this thing is there, and it would be really nice if it wasn't there, but it is there and it's unavoidable, and we just have to minimize it. Like that's the way it's usually spoken of.
But sorry, can you repeat your statement a bit?
So most of the time when we speak of the subjective element in science,
Yes.
the way we say it is as if it's an enemy and we want to minimize its presence. Yeah, we're unhappy about the fact that it exists and we want to minimize it, but we accept that, it will be there to some extent.
Okay. So I thought something doesn't exist, but I see an evidence in favor of the existence. Then I have to accept it.
Yeah. So what I'm coming to is, I mean, it seems clear that it's impossible to get rid of it. So wouldn't it be more reasonable to not see it as a sort of enemy, and see it as more something which is also equally helpful in the progress of science, and not, something which is going head on against objectivity in
That
science.
is where what I said, there is after all an element of genius in science, where to a large extent this happens. For example, take the example I gave some time back, Subramaniam Chandrasekhar. When he was a PhD student in Cambridge in the early 1930s, he proposed, let's not go into the physics, of something where a star massive beyond a certain mass, 1.4 solar masses or something, will contract against its pull of gravity, and it will go on contracting ad infinitum. That was the statement at this stage. Later came two more stages, that it can be resisted, its contraction may be resisted, but it's called neutron degeneracy rather than electron degeneracy, which Chandrasekhar studied. And finally, at the end, even if that is not sufficient, it leads to what's called the formation of a black hole. The physics of black hole as a consequence of Einstein, and in that case Newtonian gravity won't work decisively, and the consequence of Einstein's theory of general relativity has not only explanation but a reasonably clear understanding that black hole is not something supernatural being proposed. But in the 1930s, when Chandrasekhar tried to, I'm telling you the story in some detail because this will give us something about the sociology and psychology of established scientists. When Chandrasekhar started publishing, Arthur Eddington, who was probably his teacher also, became very, very unhappy about the result. He thought Chandrasekhar had used relativity, he had used quantum mechanics in some way or other. But Eddington thought the marriage between relativity and quantum mechanics is here totally unfounded and irrelevant. It's not justified. And Eddington opposed left and right Einstein's theory because he thought it is, sorry, Chandrasekhar's theory, because he thought if something goes on contracting ad infinitum to zero volume or whatever, this is not something you can see happening in nature. So the whole idea is a not N-O-U-G-H-T. N-A-U-G-H-T. But That was what would be the consequence. Till then, exactly how a black hole solution would survive and what would be the features of a black hole were not known. But Eddington became so passionate about it. That's because he was a senior British scientist, very, very established, someone who made a name by verifying Einstein's theory of relativity, general relativity, and so on. He could not stand it. So he went all out to kind of discredit Chandrasekhar. He convened a meeting of the Royal Society one evening, made Chandrasekhar speak, and made himself the subsequent speaker. Chandrasekhar spoke about his idea, and Eddington attacked Chandrasekhar left and right. And after all, Chandrasekhar was a young guy. He could not stand that criticism at that time and couldn't defend. And he felt thoroughly humiliated. Subsequently, in the a few months or I don't remember after that, there was a big astronomers meeting or astrophysicists meeting in Paris, where Chandrasekhar, whether he spoke or not, I don't remember, but Eddington spoke, and in very flowery language, and that's where aesthetics comes, flowery, confusing, and elegant language with a lot of metaphors, attacked Chandrasekhar's work, so much so that Chandrasekhar felt completely shattered. When he sent a slip to the chairman of the session saying that I want to respond to Professor Eddington's criticism, the chairman wrote back saying, I suggest that you don't. So in the presence of that towering personality, Chandrasekhar was trampled altogether. That was extreme humiliation. It led Chandrasekhar to leave that field, leave that country, go to America, work on entirely different fields, until he came back to it much later in his life. But as you said, this enmity notwithstanding, finally, existence of black holes and the viability and validity of Chandrasekhar limits became established. Unfortunately, I believe Eddington was no more at that time. Had he been there, the approach you suggest is not to keep enmity, but rather accept it as a fact of the world, would have been more sporting for Eddington. So your point is correct. I agree with that.
Welcome. So Rajesh, you have some comment?
Who? Sure.
No, I don't have one.
Okay. Okay. Thank
More question? Sure.
Okay. So
Can
my
you
question,
take off your mask because I'm short of hearing?
my question might be a little elaborate, so just bear with me. So the force of Whiteheadian constructivism or Rortian pragmatism or even continental postmodernism comes from the fact that the scientific metaphysics has been working on an appearance reality distinction for quite a long time. And this alienates metaphysics from experience. And this is why the slogan back to experience. So do you even think, or do you think that it is possible to establish a global metaphysical theory which is scientific and does not alienate lay people or philosophers and social scientists and so on?
What you talk about is too broad a canvas for discussion here, and also too broad for my own very limited reason of the reading of the subject. But this appearance reality distinction or whatever you talk about, we can discuss it personally later, that there is reality irrespective of our feeling. That is a particular, if you call it by metaphysics, I am meaning worldview, nothing more than that, no supernatural thing. At least science is guided by these things. There are people who find special occasions to counter that. For example, if you are walking along a dark field on a dead and dark night, and suddenly a rope kind of hits or rather your foot hits a rope, for a second or two you think you have been attacked by a snake. It is finally an illusion or hallucination, but those 2 seconds when you are panic stricken, you are actually seeing a rope, but you are thinking you are seeing a snake. So the reality is subject to my inadequate, if you call it inadequate life. But suppose there is some circumstances where this 2 seconds interval is expanded to 5,000 years and we are experiencing something misleadingly, then of course the reality that exists beyond us is replaced by a mere appearance in our understanding. Now, scientists may be making such mistakes. There's no problem in that. Till we are corrected, we have to live with it until it's corrected. Now, the general thing about making claims about something transcending the present experience or not can be part of universal knowledge. That opens a Pandora's box, and I don't think I'm qualified to discuss this within such a short period. But thanks for raising the question.
Okay, Vishnu, I have one. So your
Sorry,
broad point was like, broadly you're telling the scientists should be open to the ideas from so-called non-scientist intellectuals and, whatever they're feeling. But
no, I don't say that. I
No,
mean,
no, yeah,
that's a viewpoint.
that's a viewpoint.
Give
probably
and
that you
take
have to-
will help.
Yes. Now, but if you also look at, let's look at an example. Let's say I'm a Bengali, and let's say I tell someone, I don't know, for example, a very famous Rabindra Sangeet,
Okay.
which is on the singing side, correct?
Okay.
And I'm in this so-called, in your definitions, intellectual people, artists and something. Everyone would going to tell me, oh, you don't know this Rabindra Sangeet. How, I mean, but at the same time, let's say, for example, I tell, do you know the work of, let's say, Jagadish Chandra Bose or maybe Meghnad Saha, for example? That is being kind of taken society, but a more accepted way in some way, correct? So in that sense, if you think of both this, in the same sort of intellectual level, science get a raw deal in somewhat raw.
Yes, they do get. May I take a few minutes to answer this question?
Yeah, maybe, yeah, okay.
Three, four. Because sometime back somewhere else I gave a talk. Actually, it was online. It is probably in the YouTube. And there I started the discussion with this experience that history, idea of history or literature or art should be part of our culture of a scientist. That is acknowledged. That science should be part of a non-scientist culture. That is never acknowledged. I am forced to tell you two stories. First story is about my experience in Allahabad Harishchandra Research Institute, where my very eminent and colleague was Professor Ashok Sen, the world famous person, and I'm really proud to be his colleague for 3 decades. Now, there is a very active theatre group in Allahabad, and most of the famous Bengali stage theatre people used to come there periodically for theatre festivals. And since I am interested in such things, I used to be routinely kind of introduced to them. Sometimes I had dinner with them and so on. On one such occasion, I won't name him, but one of the leading stage personalities of Kolkata went there. He used to go there earlier also. Someone introduced me to him and said something that this person works in a science institute called Harishchandra Institute and so on, and said that they have a very eminent colleague called Ashok Sen. I said, yes, I'm really proud to be his younger colleague. Then my friend in Allahabad said more things in praise of Ashok Sen, because being an Allahabadi, he knew about this awards like Uri Milner Award, which Ashok had received and so on. He went on to praise Ashok Sen. This stage personality, I'm not naming him, but he's one of the topmost ones. Great. And then he slowly whispered to me, by the way, who is this Ashok Sen? Was this the same person who was a minister in Indira Gandhi's cabinet? I won't comment, but suppose I, as a scientist, in spite of this, that person remains a cultural figure in our country.
Yes.
But
Yes.
suppose I was told something about a leading stage actor, say Shambhu Mitra, and I responded by saying, who is this Shambhu Mitra?
Surgery.
Is it that Shambhu who sits in the tea shop over there and talks a lot? Then I would be branded and cultureless person. And the second experience is my own experience when I was finishing class 10. A person who was a family friend, again, he was a rather respected professor of humanities in Calcutta University. I'm doing my best to keep his identity undisclosed. He was a family friend and he was well read on many things. I had just finished my class 10. He was speaking to me with great affection, saying that, look, now you must study a lot of literature. Now you have some free time. I know you will do science, but you should study this and that. I know you should study Mopassa, you should study Aldous Huxley and so on. I said, yes, I try to study. He said, yes, that's very important. You will study science, but that doesn't mean that you will remain uncultured.
Yes.
At that stage, whatever knowledge of literature and such things I had was more than the knowledge of science possessed by this very, very erudite gentleman. Of course, then I was a 16-year-old kid, I couldn't respond, but this also has bugged me a little bit. So I think your question is answered
Okay,
in the
thanks.
affirmative.
Okay.
Dawkins.
Okay, so unless I'm presuming that there is none more, so if
Yeah,
there is something, please continue to talk with Biswarup. So thank you, Biswarup, very much. So please clap him on.
Thank you.